Hi, and welcome to Municon. I'm Nigel Pickering with the Washington Stormwater Center and also with WSU Pullman. And I will be moderating today for the presentation entitled Redmond Paired Watershed Study. It's by John Lenth of Herrera and Jessica Atlakson of City of Redmond. We will have about 20 minutes of presentation and about 10 minutes of questions, depending how long things go. Please type your questions in the chat box and I will read them back to the presenters at the end of their verbal presentation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Again, I'm Jessica Atlakson. I'm an environmental geologist with the City of Redmond, and I'm really excited to be co-presenting with John Lenth from Herrera on this project. The Redmond Paired Watershed Study was selected for implementation in 2014 through the Stormwater Action Monitoring, or SAM program, which is a collaborative stormwater monitoring program in Western Washington that is funded by more than 90 phase 1 and 2 municipal stormwater permittees and administered by the Washington Department of Ecology. SAM's studies measure the effectiveness of stormwater management efforts and communicate that information for adaptive management of stormwater regionally. So the goal for this particular study is to measure the effectiveness of watershed-scale rehabilitation efforts implemented by Redmond and King County at improving receiving water conditions over a 10-year period. This project is a SAM-funded study, and information is available on their website at ecology.washington.gov/SAM. Today's presentation will summarize the results and key findings from analyses performed on the data from monitoring in the water years 2016 through 2019. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So for some background, in February 2014, the Redmond Citywide Watershed Management Plan was approved. The overall goal of this plan is to direct rehabilitation efforts to watersheds where they will provide the most immediate environmental benefit. The approach to accomplish this was broken into 4 sub-goals. First is to provide a baseline of scientific information evaluating watershed rehabilitation potential. With that data, the second was to identify watersheds within Redmond that had the greatest potential to respond to rehabilitation efforts. The plan identified 6 watersheds in this category, including Monticello and Tosh, which we'll focus on later in this presentation. The plan also outlined a process to identify specific tools to rehabilitate the 6 highest priority watersheds mentioned earlier that were identified in step 2 by 2060. And finally, the plan established an adaptive management framework for evaluating the effectiveness of the plan. So with that background, I'll turn it over to John, who's going to step more into the details of the study.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. So here, the premise here is that Redmond was really trying to get out in front of this rehabilitation effort. And so the study question for the Redmond Paired Watershed Study is, are stormwater retrofits effective at rehabilitating receiving water conditions in small urbanized streams? And there's really 2 parts to that question. There is how much retrofit is enough to kind of move the needle on rehabilitating these creeks. And then kind of a second question that we're looking at with the Redmond Paired Watershed Study are what are the metrics themselves that are most effective at detecting that change. And so that's kind of where we started. We initiated the study with a pretty in-depth literature review, like who else has been looking at this question. And I want to preference the study question in that we're looking at this at the watershed scale. So when we started the project, we went out and looked around and found that really this is a pretty unique study, and that at this scale, there's very few data or studies out there asking this question. Lots of studies to show that we can go in at the watershed scale and really, wreck these creeks, if you will, but very few are available to show how can we bring them back? How can we restore them? How can we rehabilitate them? If you go down at kind of the smaller scales, we've had lots of studies that look at the individual B&P performance, maybe performance at the parcel scale, but this is a very unique study in looking at it at the watershed scale, and really a fairly significant data gap that we need to fill. This conferences probably have lots and lots of different talks on policy and programs and such, and we want to know, are those programs and policies effective at that watershed scale, and really kind of, getting at the biological communities we're trying to impact. So this is the project team. As Jessica said, it's a SAM funded project. City of Redmond is the project sponsor, and then the actual data collection, reporting, and data analysis is being jointly conducted by King County and Herrera. So diving into the experimental design, it's a little bit of a misnomer saying that this is a paired watershed study. We actually have 3 different types of watersheds we're looking at. There's our application watersheds, and there's 3 of those. And those are watersheds that have been prioritized by the Redmond Citywide Watershed Plan for Restoration Active. So if you can think of those as our treatment watersheds. We have 2 reference watersheds that are relatively pristine and not prioritized for watershed for rehabilitation. They just don't need it. And then we have 2 control watersheds that are fairly significantly impacted. At the current time, they're not prioritized. We'll get to them down the road, but you can think of those as the control watersheds. So the application watersheds is really what we're looking at to see, can we move the needle in terms of bringing them back? Just to give you a sense as to what these watersheds look like, they range in size from say 90 to 615 acres. As you might have guessed, the reference watersheds are fairly forested, and all the other ones are kind of a mix of residential and commercial. Lots of monitoring stations in these watersheds that I'll go into more detail on. We have 14 different water quality and flow stations, 19 physical habitat stations that we combine with biological monitoring. So what are we measuring? We have a whole suite of different parameters that we're looking at. We have hydrologic monitoring, which is continuous flow monitoring. We have water quality monitoring, and we're targeting 12 storm events per year, 4 base flow events for 11 different parameters, metals, nutrients, more conventional parameters. We do habitat monitoring, and we do sediment quality monitoring and biological monitoring annually. And we've tried really hard to keep this study in sync with the SAM, Small Stream Ambient Program, monitoring program. So all of our protocols are working off the same playbook. And I think it's important to note, kind of going back to what I said earlier about the goal of the study, we have different types of BMPs we're implementing in these watersheds. So flow control, where we might expect to see a response from a hydrologic monitoring, and maybe if we can actually restore the natural hydrology of these systems, we might see that in habitat monitoring. We have, monitoring that's specifically focused, or BMPs that are only focused on water quality. So we need to be able to look at the water quality impacts. And then that biological monitoring is really kind of integrating all of them. And so again, I think it's important to be looking at multiple different endpoints and trying to figure out which are the most important, the most useful for seeing if we're restoring these systems. I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica to kind of talk about what we're doing in these watersheds.
Great, thanks, John. So as John mentioned, within the application watersheds, the city has been focusing some of our rehabilitation efforts. So the first application watershed we'll take a look at is Tosh. We focused on 3 different categories of rehabilitation efforts. So operational controls, habitat improvement, and structural retrofits. The city had planned to build a large vault near the Tosh Mid station of this watershed, but unfortunately had to stop the plans due to concern of local residents in the neighborhood. Because of that, city efforts in this watershed have focused mainly on habitat improvement. In water year 2017, the city installed some large woody debris downstream of the Tosh Mouth station. And in water year 2019, 40,000 square feet of riparian planting was accomplished in that same area. And then in water year 2018, a fish culvert was added near the Tosh Mouth station. So that summarizes what we've done so far in the Tosh watershed. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next application watershed, which is the Monticello watershed. Using funds from a King County Waterworks grant, the city increased street sweeping on all public roads within this watershed from quarterly to monthly in water year 2018, and then to biweekly in water year 2019. Later in this presentation, we'll go into the details about the effectiveness of this operational control. In addition to street sweeping, the city's also been actively engaging residents in this watershed through mailers, social media pushes, and reaching out through the schools to the kids about planned rehabilitation efforts to really ensure community support so that we don't run into some of the issues that we ran into with the Tosh watershed. For habitat improvement, in water year 2017, we installed about 400 feet of large woody debris in the northern portion of the watershed. And then in water year 2018, an additional 400 feet was installed downstream of that. In water year 2019, we did supplemental planting and invasives removal in the Fisher Village Native Growth Protection Easement, which is kind of near Mont 3. Yeah, right there. And additionally, the city is working to finalize rehabilitation designs for the Smithwood Pond, which is in the northern portion of the watershed. And for structural retrofits, the city just recently installed continuous monitoring and adaptive control infrastructure called OPTI at 2 stormwater ponds that aren't shown on this map. They're to the western extent of the map. And we'll provide more details of this retrofit later in the presentation. And additionally, tomorrow, one of my coworkers is presenting this information of a pilot project in the Green Stormwater Infrastructure design track, if you'd like to see more detailed information on that. The city is also currently evaluating other retrofit projects within this watershed with the goal of construction in water year 2022. And so we'll move on to the third application site, which is Evans Creek. And Evans Creek actually isn't within the city limits, but we included it in the study because our partner, King County, had plans for installing 2 vaults, which you can see with the red X's on this map. They were both installed in water year 2017. The first vault has a detention volume of approximately 1,100 cubic feet and treats about a half an acre of impervious area. And the second vault has a detention volume of approximately 1,400 cubic feet and treats 0.6 acres of impervious area. So with that, I'll hand it back over to John.
So in looking at our kind of a paired watershed design, what we're really, the kind of the pattern of interest we're after here is that we, in our application watersheds, we're able to see one or more of those endpoints show a trend of improvement. And so, and then in our control and our reference watersheds, either conditions stay static or worst case scenario, they get worse. And so that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of the statistical analyses that we applied to the data. We've done quite a bit of different analyses on the data. And for this talk, I'm really just going to focus in on the analyses that were specifically directed at some of the BMPs, programmatic and structural that Jessica mentioned at the beginning of the talk. I'm going to go through and just very briefly describe what we've done and then go into more detail on the specific results. So for hydrologic monitoring, we have a number of hydrologic metrics that we compute on an annual basis, so low pulse count, high pulse count type metrics that we'll be looking at correlation analyses to see, are they going up or down over time? We're only at year 4 in this study, so we don't have a whole lot of data to look for, statistically significant correlations with that data. So we've been more focusing on what we call the rainfall runoff response analysis, where we've taken every single storm event that occurred during our 4-year monitoring period and calculated a rainfall runoff response. So for a given rainfall amount, how much discharge volume did we see and what was the peak discharge rate? And so we analyzed that rainfall runoff response, and what we're hoping to see is over time, we see less of a peak discharge rate or a volume for the same amount of rainfall. So that's one analysis that we performed. We took that same data and we applied it to the data from the Evans Creek watershed before and after the vaults came online to really hone in to see, did those vaults make any kind of difference in terms of that rainfall runoff response? So looking at those data or those results, this is looking at the entire watershed for that rainfall runoff response. And what you're seeing here are the results from a Kendall's-Tal correlation coefficient. So if these correlation coefficients are positive, that means we're getting more either rainfall, or in this case, this is the maximum, the flow volume and the maximum flow rate. If they're positive, that's going up over time. If they're negative, they're going down. And these bold values indicate where we've got a statistically significant trend. And without looking at all the details of the numbers, you can see they're all negative, and there's quite a few of these that are significant. So what in the heck is going on here? Why are we seeing this trend in decreasing rainfall runoff response across the entire study period? Well, there's a good answer for that when we started digging into the data. it turns out that we had a kind of a regional trend in precipitation that was impacting the entire city. So for each of the 4 years that we were monitoring, we were seeing less and less annual precipitation that was impacting that rainfall runoff response. And so I bring this up just to illustrate some of the confounding factors that we have to deal with in a study like this. We've got our isolated study design where we're looking at individual BMPs, but overlaid on top of that are some of these regional trends that we have to kind of sift through to be able to see that trend of interest. So going in more in detail on the Evans Creek comparison, what we're seeing here is this is a comparison of before and after, and what we're really seeing is that there really was no difference in either of these stations before and after the vaults came online, which was a little disappointing. We were hoping to see a good, healthy response from these vaults. And so when we started looking at, well, what might be going on, there was a couple different hypotheses that we had. What first thing is this overarching hydrologic trend, this interannual hydrologic trend that I described might be a confounding the results. We might not be able to see the pattern that we're looking at. The ponds might have had a design defect, so we weren't getting the performance that we were expected. But I think the more likely solution or the cause of not seeing a better performance out of these ponds, these vaults, is they just were treating too small of a basin area. We're looking at is only 1.1 acres of the basin, and we've got 397 total acres of basin area, and we really just weren't treating enough area to kind of see that signal from the noise. And so again, getting back to what we're looking for in the study is how much retrofit is enough? How much of that 397 acres do we need to keep chipping away at to be able to see that response? So switching to water quality, 3 different types of analyses we looked at. We simply, first of all, looked at correlations of water quality concentrations over time. So are we just getting a gradual decrease in our pollutant concentrations with time? We also calculated annual loads using our water quality data and our flow data. So we had, for each parameter, we said, well, what is the annual load? And that's important if we are actually using, say, infiltration to improve conditions, because we're losing actual volumes of water that would impact our loads. And then we actually did a very specific comparison of the water quality during the different periods of street sweeper implementation, and really kind of drilled down on that specific question. So here are the results from that, and I've tried to take some very complex tables and make them more user-friendly. What this is showing is that out of our 11 water quality parameters, we had statistically significant trends for 6 of them: TSS, dissolved organic carbon, fecal coliform, hardness, total copper, total nitrogen. And then I've taken the actual numbers of stations and highlighted where we had significant decreasing trends. So you're seeing one out of the 3 stations in the Monticello Basin, we had a decreasing trend. And then I've kind of lumped the reference and control stations to see, did we see anything in those basins compared to the application? And what we're looking for is, for Monticello, more of these, more parameters showing statistically significant decreases and more stations. And when you look at this correlation analysis, we're actually seeing something here where you can imagine that, Tosh is showing a response, but we're also showing a very good response in Monticello. And I want you to keep an eye on the total copper and TSS, because that's a trend that kind of is consistent as we move through these analyses. So here's water quality. That was storm flow we were looking at. This is base flow. And again, we're seeing, something might be going on here in Monticello. We're seeing, a decrease in dissolved zinc. Hardness is not a parameter that we typically get too concerned about or care about in terms of water quality impacts, but we are, this is an interesting that we're seeing this dissolved zinc. Again, here, this is looking at that annual load estimate over time. And so this is taking into account both the decrease in water, actual water, and possibly a decrease in concentration. And so, this really got us interested. We're seeing quite a response here in Monticello Creek. And I do want to remind everybody that we also saw flow volumes were going down over time due to that regional trend we were talking about. So there could be a confounding influence on these results. But again, this is looks promising. We're seeing a whole lot of action here, if you will, in Monticello, and not so much in some of these other basins. So this is where we get into that very controlled analysis where we actually compared the specific street sweeping periods in Monticello Creek, and we go from quarterly to monthly to biweekly. And what you're seeing here is a statistical comparison where if the letter at the top of these box plots is the same, then they're not statistically different. And so you can see that we've got a different letter between the biweekly and the quarterly sweeping, meaning they are statistically different. And then AB means that the monthly was not different from either of the other two. But this is the trend we're looking for. We're seeing as we increase the sweeping frequency, we start to see a reduction in our, in this case, total copper concentrations. And when you look at the data together, again, we're seeing kind of a response here in the Monticello Creek Basin that we did not see anywhere else. Again, it's total suspended solids and total copper. In this case, we had total nitrogen. Maybe total nitrogen, we're getting something happening, but we also saw it in the reference and control. But this TSS and total copper reduction looks really promising. So when we looked at things collectively, we found that we had 3 separate types of analyses that suggested that street sweeping was moving the needle on copper and TSS. And what really got us excited is that Herrera had also completed a study for Seattle Public Utilities that found essentially the same parameters were being reduced by street sweeping. It was particulate copper, and in this case, a coarser fraction of the TSS. But these were very different experimental designs. For the SPU study, we were actually looking at concentrations measured at edge of pavement, whereas this was in the Redmond Paired Watershed Study is looking in the actual receiving water. So you have a lot more confounding influences on the Redmond Paired Watershed Study. But this was very promising that we were able to see this response from 2 different studies with different experimental designs. So conclusions from the first 4 years of study. First of all, we have this interannual hydrologic trend that was, we were seeing it all across the city. That is more of an issue that we need to be cognizant of as we look at the data going forward. We saw the 2 detention vaults in Evans Creek weren't really providing the benefit that we'd hoped for, and that's likely because they're just not treating enough watershed area. And then we found this very promising trend in TSS and copper concentrations in Monticello Creek that appear to be related to street sweeping. So where do we go from here? Jessica mentioned that we are looking at a pond retrofit, and this is really taking 2 ponds that are essentially built to older standards with very traditional outlet control structures, and basically making them smart ponds where they can be dynamically operated, where they can sense incoming storms, hold or release the volume, water in their storage, and basically take a pond and existing infrastructure and optimize its performance with some new technology. And so we'll be able to leverage a lot of our existing monitoring stations. If you look here as a kind of a blow up of where those ponds are, we have our mouth station down here that we'll be able to compare from the last 4 years of data to see what kind of response we get. And then we'll actually be looking at the performance of the ponds with the Opti system and doing some modeling to predict what those ponds would have done with the older outlet control structures, and directly evaluating the performance of the ponds, and then again using the in-stream data to see what kind of response we're seeing in the actual receiving water. And with that, I just want to point out we've got a number of resources available that you can access for the Redmond Paired Watershed Study. All of our project reports are available online. All of the raw flow monitoring data that we've been showing, you can pull off the King County Hydrologic Information Center. All of our water quality and sediment data is available through the college's EIM, and then the biological monitoring data is available through the Puget Sound Benthos database. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jessica.
Yeah, so I just want to wrap up by saying thanks to Sam and the participating stormwater permittees for funding this project, and to our technical advisory committee for the input and guidance on this project. And like John said, you can find all the data on those resources, those websites. And additionally, you can find information about all the SAM projects on Ecology's website at ecology.wa.gov/SAM. So with that, we can open it up for questions.
Well, thanks a lot, Jessica and John. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box, and I'll read them out, and they can respond. At this time, I'm not seeing, oh yeah, they come. Oh, it's starting to come. All right, here's the first question from Scott. Any evaluation of potential impacts of soil TSS mobilization due to more or less construction projects within the paired watersheds? Or maybe other one-off types of potential pollutant sources during the study or sampling periods?
That's a great question. I think that what we're looking at is if we detect those trends, I think we have to look kind of under every single rock to confirm that the trend that we're looking at is related to either a structural or non-structural BMP. So I think that's part of the homework that we have to do, is make sure that if we're saying there's a response, that we have looked at all other potential factors that might be influencing that response. And so I think it kind of starts with detecting that response and then doing our homework to make sure that we're accurately determining that cause and effect.
Okay, we have another question. Are you considering doing any more retrofits in Evans Creek to treat more of the watershed?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to have to work with our partners in King County to see if they have any plans for that.
I have a quick question. I was just wondering if you'd considered plotting any of your data in cumulative form. So cumulative precip on the x-axis versus cumulative response to take out the effect of precipitation.
That's a great question. And so a lot of what we did that I didn't show here is kind of what you're describing, Nigel. We did a lot of analyses to look for relationships between our variables and other confounding factors. For example, we did a lot of regression analyses to say, if the flows in the creek were going up, did we see a response for, say, TSS? So we'd expect sometimes when you get more energy in these creeks, you're going to mobilize more sediment, and we don't really care about that, right? So what we care about is if you take out that response between flow and TSS mobilization, is there a trend that's left over that we can look at that's related to our BMPs? So if you dig into our report, we did a lot of modeling to try to remove these confounding factors, and that was one in particular that we were looking at, is responses to our pollutant concentrations to flow. We modeled it. If we are able to see an accurate or a model that was predictive, we pulled out the residuals from that model, and we looked at the residual variability to see, is that response related to structural or non-structural BMP kind of hidden in the weeds there. That's part of the trick, is try to tease out noise in the data that you don't really care about to find that signal that you're really after. And we applied a lot of different statistical techniques to try to get at that question.
Okay, we have one other question. Are the ponds designed to address flow control only? Can infiltrating geosides be implemented in these watersheds?
You want to take that, Jessica, or you want?
If you want to go ahead.
Well, the vaults themselves were only flow control, the ones in Evans Creek, and then the Opti systems are really mostly about flow control. But that's not to say that we couldn't be doing, other GSI retrofits in those same basins. Right now, we're just mostly isolated on the flow control benefits of those two projects.
Okay, I think it's we have a 2-minute time warning, so I think it's time to start wrapping up. If you can answer something in less than 2 minutes, what treatment technology was used at Evans Creek vaults?
Just a simple vault. They're just there's no dead storage in those. They're just a simple stormwater detention vaults. It's all about, it's not even looking at reductions in volume. It's all peak flow control in those systems. So
okay, great. Well, I want to thank Jessica and John for this great presentation, and we'll look forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.